Well, welcome everybody. So tonight we are on the book Prince Caspian. And this week we're doing part one, the first 8 chapters. And I was saying just before we hit the recording and pray, how much I really enjoy this story. I'm so glad that I thought to intersperse these stories with the Lewis work. And just, I think it's really good. So
Are we doing the stories in order interspersed with this other stuff?
Like, do
is
you
this the
mean?
book after Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? This is the
Oh,
next.
so this is the book in series order
Mhm.
that comes after The Horse and His Boy.
The Horse and His Boy.
Yeah.
Where does the Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe fit into it?
So Lion and Witch and the Wardrobe.
This is
So
year
you have
before.
Magician's Nephew is the first one we didn't do. Second one is Lion and Witch and the Wardrobe. Third one is The Horse and His Boy, and the fourth one is Prince Caspian.
Okay,
So we have been reading them in order. We just didn't do the first one. Although Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe is the first one written.
right.
Yeah.
And a bit of a standalone.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is kind of a sequel because The Horse and His Boy is from the Golden Age but really didn't involve our 4 children very much. So we're kind of back to our regular cast, our main characters with this one.
Now, are they still living with the professor?
No, they're back home.
It all happened a year ago, and now all of them are sitting in the seat railway station.
Yeah.
Trunks.
Yeah, and they're off to boarding school.
But from home, not from the professor.
From home, yeah, because mother has packed the sandwiches. Father has been discussed as well. So there's no evidence that they're leaving from professor's house. I assume at this point, the war's over.
1 year stay in the country is not so long.
No, but this is now 1951 as the publishing date of this one. So
But
the year
it's a-
before my mom was.
And it's a year after the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, according
Yeah.
to Luke.
Yeah.
So they still should be staying.
Well, it depends on what year they went to
suppose.
stay at. I feel like you may be getting hitched on to a few details that are not relevant to our
I'm just
discussion.
curious about this.
Uh-huh. Ready to move on?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay,
It does take me a little while with these to get into what's going on, and a lot of it is wondering
those kinds of
back
details.
stuff that's not there.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll begin with chapter 1, entitled The Island. So, one of the first questions that I had in reading this chapter is, what do you think, how does this book connect with the former Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? So we've just talked about some of the kind of technical side of it. I'm asking maybe more of a literary, theological, philosophical kind of question. Mary Craddock Keating, are you doing hand exercises or did you want to answer?
Sorry, my hand was hurting, so I was just stretching it a bit.
Okay,
Sorry
that's
about
fine.
that. Didn't
No,
realize
I-
you could see it.
It was the thing I could see the most.
Oh, it's the same 4 kids.
Same 4 kids, yeah,
Edmund is there.
yeah.
Um,
So again, I'm looking for something a little more literary, a little more philosophical / theological. And it's not a pop quiz.
They've been tugged back to Narnia.
Okay? Always a good idea to clear the obvious first.
And I know this goes more into more chapters as well.
Yeah.
To me, the whole feel of the first 8 chapters was because the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was kind of like the sacrifice,
Mhm.
kind of like Jesus was the sacrifice. And then this one to me seemed like it was going into kind of Paul's journey.
Okay.
Of uh, because you have people that are afraid because they're being killed
Mhm.
for their beliefs and stuff, and then you've got, you know, one person that's kind of standing up and saying, hey, this is maybe not the way it should be.
Okay.
That, like, that was the whole thought that was going through my mind. And even that whole, when they're talking about the Prince Caspian, when the dwarf is telling of Prince Caspian, and they're talking about how they're killing people and stuff, like, it immediately led me to Stefan and, you know, the people that were killed because of their beliefs.
Right. That's a really interesting observation. So you have gospel and now acts to some
Yes.
degree.
Yeah,
Okay, I
that's
like
kind
it.
of where
like
my
it.
mind went. I don't know if that was right.
Okay.
My thoughts were, time was brought into this.
Time, okay.
And so like, and it's really important to us because like God is outside of time. For us, time
Right.
is everything, but for, you know, 1,000 years, it's like a day for him.
Right.
And so I sensed that here where they were pulled back in and it was like 300 years later
Yeah.
and all this history.
Yeah,
There was no, so did Lewis bring that in just to, you know, put that grasp to God's outside of time?
Maybe.
yeah, I was really struck with that because he's not consistent with it. But he talks about nobody seemed to have noticed they were gone because of the golden age. And they came back. And it seems to me that Lewis is trying to struggle with living outside of time, living where time doesn't exist, and what that would be like. But then I think it was in the first 8 chapters, he makes a comment that they've been in Narnia for 2 days. And I thought, no, they can't have been in Narnia for 2 days. If it's outside of time. So it seemed to me that it reminded me more of his understanding of time in whatever we read before this one that we're reading now. And
Screw tape.
Screw tape.
Yeah.
Before that. What was the one
Oh,
before
the
that?
Great
The
Divorce.
Great Divorce. So when he was talking there, he had the same kind of, it was almost like a limbo or something that he was suggesting, that where time operated before you got to the place where it didn't. But here there doesn't seem to be a limbo state. Exactly.
So the hypothesis is not that Narnia has no time, but it has a separate time from our world. And that's why, even though the children had lived a lifetime in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, you know, went from children to adulthood. And then when they tumble out of the wardrobe, they're back to children because almost no time had been used up of our world's time, even though they were all those years in Narnia. Now, as they are pulled back into Narnia, we don't know exactly if it's hundreds, maybe thousands at one point is suggested of years have passed, even though only 1 year has passed of our time. So there is time. They're just on 2 different time streams, which likely has to do with Lewis's interest in the planets and different suns. Different planets would have different revolutions and all that. And of course, Lewis is not the first person. A lot of stuff, science fiction, he'll get from G.H. Wells and other authors. And so I'm not exactly sure all what ideas he borrows. This may be one of those. So he's playing with that. For myself, in terms of the connection between this book and the former one in chapter 1, I was reminded that when the children hear Aslan's name for the first time, most of them, not Edmund, of course, but Peter, Susan, and Lucy, have a wonderful feeling. And Lewis uses a few different similes to try and describe that feeling to his child audience. And one of them, school is end of term for school and it's the holidays. And so I recognize that in this opening of this chapter, the children's holidays have ended and they are now going back to school. So I wondered for Lewis, we'll see in, I think Don Treader, Aslan gives some of the rationale why these children are brought into this world in the first place, and that is so that they can get to know him. So I wonder if part of the connection is for his fictional characters that the time away from Narnia, they're beginning to maybe not lose faith, but cool off in their ardor in this return. Because the first thing that Peter says is no arithmetic, no. So we're back to holidays, right? And we're back into the sphere of Aslan. And it's almost like this renewal movement that's happening. So I was thinking that there may be some connection in that way. And kind of like Norma with the Gospel Acts, it's speculation. I mean, we don't have to worry about, am I right? And Lewis is not presently available for an interview anyways.
I'm quite an obsession with apples.
Yes,
And then it's not in chapter 1, but later on, the discussion of Adam naming the animals. So there's some more overtly obvious things seem to me to be coming in.
yes, yes. And you actually, in Magician Nephew, has it been read The Magician's Nephew? The Magician's
Are we gonna
Nephew?
read it?
No, no, that's
I
the
read
one
it
that I
years ago.
didn't do. So The Magician's Nephew is kind of a prequel to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It's how Jadis, who later becomes the White Witch in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, how she gets from her world into Narnia. One of the features there is a piece of fruit that is part of what will limit the White Witch's power in Narnia. And it's also a healing fruit. So fruit is certainly a part of the matrix of story elements that Lewis is pulling on. And, you know, that has resonances with classics as well as biblical. So yeah, that's definitely,
And Susan chooses to shoot at a teeny tiny apple very far away.
Yeah.
As the target.
Yeah.
When the kids are establishing. That was another thing about the time. The kids gradually became feeling more like they had the time before.
Yeah.
They were still feeling like kids.
Yeah.
And then they did things.
Yeah.
And put on things.
so we're going to talk about that as we get to those chapters. Do you want to just hold on to that then?
Yeah.
So one of the things that I noticed in chapter 1 is suddenly Edmund has this ability as they're being pulled out of our world into Narnia's world. Edmund exclaims, "This is magic. I know the feel." So I was just curious, what kind of knowledge does Edmund have here that allows him this detection of magic? And how does that differ from other kinds of knowledge?
Well, he had firsthand experience with the White Witch,
Okay, so,
including the Turkish delight. And, he's the only one who really knows what effect that had on him
okay,
and how he was drawn back to her later,
okay,
even though I think he had some ideas that this was probably a bad thing.
right. So Edmund, even though he did something wrong formally, in some ways, it has experiential knowledge has become a grounding for knowledge that is now a skill or a gift to them. Because he wisely says, hold each other's hands, like stay together, right? I just thought that was kind of neat.
It's one of those things, it's hard to, you can't explain it. It's, it's a mystery. You can say magic, you can say mystery. Or it's unexplainable. So maybe Lewis is trying to bring that element out of how does the spirit work? It's a mystery.
Right? Yeah. Good. Well, and as we go through this chapter, we have the children who have taken off their socks and their shoes, and they've been in the water. And as they decide it's time that they explore the island, they think about leaving some of their stuff behind. And Susan says, "Are you mad? We might never find it again. And it's probably going to get cold and you'll want that stuff then." So I just wondered, what is the role of sensible conduct in this chapter?
I was thinking of
Karen,
this big sister Susan.
So I wasn't sure if Karen was saying something there. Okay, if you were, we weren't hearing. Sorry.
I was thinking it was kind of like the big sister,
Okay, yeah.
taking charge and making sure that everybody collects up their stuff.
Hi there. They meet in the far side there. Big sister Susan taking care of the
Yeah,
younger siblings.
Yeah, the
Okay.
younger siblings.
Yeah. And there's a wisdom to this, right? She is thinking.
And she's the queen.
She
And
is,
she's no doubt starting to feel like the queen.
right. Yeah.
Reminds me of Mrs. Beaver in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Okay. Yeah. Particularly what?
Just that practicality.
Yes. Yeah.
In the midst of everything, it's exciting. It's kind of all new again to them, it seems.
Yeah.
A new place, but she's that practicality.
Right. So Susan may have learned a thing or two herself. So again, we have this connection to the former adventurer. They are wiser this time around than the last time. But we kind of already talked about it. The last thing I wanted to kind of raise in this is there any significance to the apple trees? Talked about that a little bit. I don't know if anybody feels like we need to.
I don't know, it wasn't in this chapter, well, maybe it was in this chapter where that's all they were eating was apples,
Yeah.
apples. Well, it made me think of the Israelites and them grumbling about, oh, all reading is manna, manna, manna.
Yeah.
Sick of this already.
Yeah.
It seemed to have that same kind of
Okay.
stream
Okay.
to not being satisfied what was given to them.
Yes.
And it is a time thing too, because they had planted the apple trees when they were way back then.
Mhm.
And now the apple trees are bearing fruit. But that's a little funny because apple trees don't bear fruit forever. Like they reach a point where they stop bearing fruit. So this is somewhere along that still productive part.
I've got one that's been producing for 30 years and I wish it would quit.
It will after about 50. They do stop.
They're no good to eat anyway.
No,
Well, this just may be an element of a story. But maybe Lewis didn't know that the apple tree shouldn't be producing fruit.
no, I think you would. England, you have apple trees.
There's another thing that struck me, when they first kind of land in wherever it is, they're not sure where they are,
Mhm.
but they've got these branches sticking into them. And
Yeah.
that reminded me of the back of the wardrobe.
Oh, yes.
The same thing kind of happened.
Yeah.
Right.
They walked from there into trees and, Lucy says, do you think it's possible we've got back to Narnia?
Mm,
And Peter said, well, we could be anywhere, who knows?
yeah.
But
Yes,
she's right away, that's the connection she makes.
right, which maybe reflects longing.
Oh, I'm sure it does.
So
Mhm.
if if there is any credibility to my idea about the end of term, going back to school, returning to Narnia, then maybe these are reflections of that. She has this deep longing to return. Maybe Peter is a little more ambiguous.
I'm just wondering how it doesn't really say how aware they are as the year in England has gone past. If Narnia has stayed in their forefront, or if it's just been like a dream that kind of went off, and when they get pulled into it, they recognize it again. Because they seem, as the chapters go by, to become more aware of where they are.
Yes.
They seem to have a better sense of what's coming up. They don't recognize it at all to start off with.
Well, there seems to be internal transformation, a regaining of their former Narnian selves
Mhm.
as things go. Yeah. All right. Well, in chapter 2, we have the ancient treasure house. There wasn't a lot that I wanted to draw us into conversation. We have 8 chapters, so we don't need to drill into every one of them, but there's kind of a role of logic here. And I just thought we can open it up and talk about what is that role of logic in situations. So this is particularly around the deduction that Peter makes that they are in fact not only in Narnia, but are currently sitting within the ruins of a Car Paravel. And Peter kind of gives a 4-point treatise on why he believes it is so.
I found it interesting within that logic, there's again the experiential or in the body that kind of confirms it too, because Lucy says, I felt for hours that there was some wonderful mystery hanging over this place. So he honors, and again, that not all knowledge is just thought or
Right. So there seems then, I think that's a great observation. There seems in Lewis then an affirmation of both logic and intuition.
yeah.
Lucy intuits what Peter deduces. And those two things seem to confirm each other. So perhaps that's something like Lewis's sense of joy and the inbreaking of heaven into our ordinary moments. This is great observation. Thanks.
Yeah, it makes me think, walk by faith, not by sight type of thing. Where's your faith? You could see all these things, but maybe he was trying to pull out that, look, this is this, we had this, we can see this, we found this chess piece, this is a castle.
Yeah.
All these things, but maybe there's something more to it that has to be grasped than just what we see.
Maybe.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Walk by faith, not by sight.
Yeah. Well, at the very least, I think, having both of these things presence in very positive ways. I don't know that he would want to make an antithesis, but I think he certainly doesn't want to simply rely on logic for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. As they then establish there in those ruins, they find the treasure room at the bottom of the stairs. And I thought it was interesting, Lewis takes a little bit of time to describe the items that are there, some real treasures in the treasure house. I mean, these are expensive things, wealth, riches, and yet what the children leave with, what they insist they must take is the gifts rather than the treasure. So talk about that. Why is that the case? Why the gifts and not the treasure?
All given gifts.
Not Edmund,
Oh, it was those own fault too.
right?
In some ways, the treasure is useless.
Okay,
Even if they decide to take it, what would they do with it?
okay. Why is the treasure useless?
There's a brooch or something and rings and jewels. I mean, it's not like there's a store down the street, pawn shop, where they can exchange the jewels for money or whatever.
Okay,
And then buy food with it. And even if this was Narnia as they knew it before, I still don't have a sense that there wasn't that kind of a system.
okay. So these treasures don't have a present value for their circumstances. Wealth isn't what they need right now.
It's just like, what are you chasing after? If I gain the whole world, but lose my own soul, like if you're,
Okay.
it's the worldly things that aren't gonna amount to anything.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
it's true. You
Yeah.
can chase after all the things and you can pile them all up, but it means nothing.
Yes,
So the gifts that they took, the ones that Aslan gave them, they were the gifts.
yes.
They were the valuable, because there was a connection then to the power source.
Yes. I think we also want to hang on to this conversation a little later when the children take Trumpkin, the dwarf, down to fit him with armor. He makes an offhand remark, it's a good thing Nick Brick isn't here,
Mhm.
as an insight that we should remember. I think too, when we first encountered those gifts in Lion the Witch and the Wardrobe, one of the things we talked about is the potential of this being gifts of the spirit. And so to some degree, we may have the put on the full armor of God, the recognition of what gifts are needed in this moment. They don't know why they're here. But they know that they're here, and if they're here, it is likely for a reason. And again, connecting back to their first adventure, right? There's a reason why they were brought into Narnia the first time. Therefore, it's reasonable to posit that there is a similar reason this time for them to be brought back into Narnia. So, once again, these are the appropriate gifts. Put on the full armor of Christ, right? And they rearm themselves for this new struggle, whatever it is going to turn out to be. Carol's alluded to it a few times, that the children are becoming more of their Narnian selves. And at the end of this chapter, Peter draws his sword, Grindon, and declares, with it, I killed the wolf. There was a new tone in his voice, and the others all felt that he was really Peter, the High King, again. So, how is this happening? How is Peter the High King again? What is going on? Can we try and put our finger on that somewhat?
Well,
I
let's
think
see.
the process starts again in that treasure room. It's like they're waking up, or as they're walking around looking at things, they're telling the stories about, do you remember when I wore that? And that's the time we met so and so. And so it's those memories are all coming back.
Okay,
It kind of reminds me of the way that Mary moved into her understanding of who Jesus was.
okay,
So before his conception, she has this incredible experience. But then later on, it's almost as if she doesn't have any clue, and she moves in and out of understanding. And it's kind of like an unfolding thing.
Mhm.
Here, the partway through the chapter, it says all the battles and hunts and feasts came rushing back into their heads together. Like just the whole experience, this long time or short time or whatever it was, all came back together. And then that's when Peter's then drawing on who he had been
Mhm.
and moving into it. But they move back and forth a lot. And then there's a spot about, they've just realized that Peter is the king. And then they thought about the battery on the flashlight and wow. It's that back and forth. Not being able to quite grasp, but
Yeah.
getting closer.
Well, and even if Peter is the high king, they still need to save the battery.
I was thinking of Mary and Martha and then Lazarus. Like
Oh.
Martha came to know who Christ was
Mhm.
at that point, put her faith in him. So it's sort of like, didn't have the connection. If you would have been here, you'd have not that, but also I believe you. You can do whatever.
So connect that for us to Peter and the sword and him being the high king.
Well, I'm not sure.
Okay, it just,
But
it reminded you,
It
triggered
made me
something.
think of when you're doubting and you're not sure, and then all of a sudden, I got it.
Okay.
I know who you are.
Okay.
And
I wondered if it's something in what Lewis talks about, even if we don't feel like something, if we put ourselves into the posture because we're embodied, there will come a point when that in itself helps us do that thing, become that thing. And I wondered if that's part of the connection here. Peter reclaiming the sword is also Peter reclaiming that
his
identity. And it's kind of like the relationship between the signifier, the symbol, and the thing signified by the symbol. We kind of have them separate, right? So you have a sign for the highway, and then you have the highway itself. There seems to be a separation, but the Eucharist, for example, we have the bread, but we have Christ's body, right? The thing signified and the symbol itself are almost inseparable. We participate in Christ's body through the bread. So it's not like you can separate out, here's bread now and here's Christ's body now. That they're together, even though one is the sign, the bread is the sign, the body is the thing signified. So, chapter 3, we have the dwarf, even though I recognize when I saw the printout, I put the dwarfed on the note paper.
Dropped.
So we've talked about time a little bit, and actually, Bob, you made the observation that I did, because there's also this now realization in this chapter. Edmund comes up with this theory. Oh, I think I know what's happened. I think, we've been gone a year in our time, but in that year, Narnia time has moved differently. And so hundreds of years may have passed. And everybody seems to maybe intuit, maybe deduce the sensibleness of this suggestion, because the evidence is clear. This is not the Narnia that they left from their golden age. And yet they have only been gone a year of their time. So it seems like a pretty good theory, and it seems to fit the evidence well. And so, Bob, I had written down too, I wonder if Lewis is trying to play with this idea. God's time moves differently or is different, and as you quoted, I wrote down to 1,000 years is like a day to him, kind of thing, right? The
There's a hymn
struggle.
about that.
Sorry,
There's a hymn about that.
there is a hymn about that. Yeah, it's also in scripture. So, it may just be a story detail, but perhaps Lewis was playing with that. And as Carol says, we see it in some of his other works as well. And certainly in Screw Tape, Uncle Screw Tape talked about time. You know, the past is frozen. The present moment touches eternity because it's the moment in which God is operating now. And then the future is really in some ways open, but for God, it's all now. So yeah, the possibility of 2 time zones, as it were. As we keep moving, we see again what we've just been talking about a little bit, the progress of the children regaining their Narnian selves. And yet I noticed too, Carol, that there is a bit of a flux. There's moments when they are almost their full Narnian selves, and then other moments where they're really quite children. And so this fluctuation between child and royal, I thought kind of could reflect some of the already and the not yet. And so there we're dealing with eschatology. You know, we have this status as children of God, something that Lewis talks about. And so that has already happened. From a status point, we have been made children of God, given the Spirit, and by the Spirit, we can cry out, Abba, Father. And yet we're waiting eagerly in anticipation with all of creation for the full redemption of our mortal bodies, when we will be fully adopted, and there's this fullness. And so, you know, we're in this in between time of the already but not yet. So already we are this, and yet we have to, in an ongoing fashion, work out who we are in Christ, even as we look forward to the full completion of our salvation and being made fully children of God. Right? The last thing that I noticed in chapter 3 is once again, we have the theme that grace is anarchy. We have this rebel dwarf. He's a real criminal. But he is part of a rebellion against the established government. There is an established king. Now, how the king got there, you know, kings usually keep their thrones by power, but he occupies the throne. He is the government. He has fear. He has an army. He owns the territory. He rules. And so once again, we have this theme of grace as anarchy. So again, we have some connection to the former story, right? This time it's not winter that people are afraid of. It's not a witch who will turn people into stone. It's not magic this time. It's warfare. It's a despot. It's somebody who is hungry for power. And yet the children have been brought and seemingly are prepared to upset this world order.
I found the dwarf a very interesting character.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, you know, he's no fool. He's capable. He's very practical.
Mm-hmm.
So it kind of made me think of when Jesus was calling the disciples.
Okay.
They're all kind of practical people.
Yeah.
You know, they could do this, they could do that. They were capable, but and that's sort of kind of how I see this dwarf was kind of like along that same line.
Okay. Yeah. He certainly has not a lot of place for the supernatural, the fantastic. He's looking for swords, he's looking for boots on the ground, he's looking for some real solutions. Yeah.
I've never heard of a dwarf who was a fool.
Mhm.
Cut the fish open, clean them, no, it's very practical.
Yeah. And dwarves are from the earth, right? They're very earthy, like even more so than men. There's a closer relationship between dwarves and the ground. So there is something solid. It's why dwarves like to live underground, why they dig in caves and why they mine. There's a relationship there to that created order, but it also makes them in different mythologies, you have like elves and that they seem to be a little more closer to the angels, a little more I don't quite know the word for it, ethereal or something like that.
Esoteric.
So there is a difference. So yeah, we have this kind of grounded little fellow, and he's about to tell the story of Prince Caspian. Did you have something, Ben? Okay. I just want to make sure that you weren't trying to jump in and I wasn't stopping talking, because that happens all the time. Well, in chapter 4, we have Trumpkin telling the story of Prince Caspian. So to begin with, we have a nurse who has told Caspian of the golden age of old Narnia. So what is the value of wives' tales and children's stories when we talk about faith? Is probably where Jalen just wants to jump in, be the first to speak.
To me, it's like the parables.
Okay.
It helps you to understand, right? So when you're listening to stories, you know, you can almost assimilate with the story like a parable better than you can if you were told
Yes,
the truth,
yes.
right?
Yeah.
It brings out the element to me of slavery. There was an order. This nurse was a slave. He was he was property. He was used. Yeah, he was a teacher, but that's sort of what history was. That's what the Romans did to all their slaves. They picked better people, the ones that were smarter or whatever, and put them in
Yes.
places.
We're going to see that a little bit with Till We Have Faces, our final book in our series.
He knew the history, he knew the stories.
So I think you're thinking of Dr. Cornelius. So I'm before
That's
that
not-
with the
okay,
nurse
sorry.
who, so as this chapter opens up, we have Caspian as a young child who is just on a walk with his uncle, who is the king.
Yeah.
And his uncle is checking in with the kid and asking him about what he wants. And Caspian reveals what he wants is to live in the old times with all of these creatures and animals and dwarves and fauns and Aslan, and old Uncle Miraz is a little bit angry, and it's revealed that it's Caspian's nurse who has been looking after him. Caspian hasn't started his formal education yet, and so nurse has been just telling him stories, children's stories, old wives' tales. But in my own development, I've come to see a real important role to wives' tales. So you even have it in Tolkien, in Lord of the Rings, in the third book, when some of our main characters are brought into the houses of healing. It's an old woman, a herbalist, who is being interviewed by King Aragorn, and she remembers some rhymes. She has some of the old lore and knowledge. Aragorn is a little sharp with her to stop talking and go and get the leaf. But at one point, I think it's Gandalf that says, old wives may have remembered what others have forgotten. So it seems to me in this type of literature, wives' tales, children's stories, is an important genre that communicates wisdom. And I think for Lewis and I think for others, I think of Stanley Hauerwas says in one of his courses, is if anybody ever asks you why you believe in Jesus, you just tell them because my mother's told me so. Right? We saw with Screw Tape Letters, think we got it a little bit in Mere Christianity. I think it's reflected in the children's upbringing in these stories. Children learn the faith, the first tentative steps of faith, or learn how to walk through parents. And in those days, of course, mothers in particular. Our faith is communicated to us, not just in formal tutorial official ways, but we learn faith at home. So I think there's a value that is being expressed. And when we remember what we're reading and his goals, right? When we write for children, we should make a clear division between good and evil and write in such a way that the child wants to be on the side of good, not on the side of evil. He writes these books with the intention that it has seeds of or points to the real gospel, so that because children have inhabited these worlds, when they encounter the real thing in their own world, they will recognize it and desire it. And so in some ways, we are reading the same history that Caspian was taught by his nurse. And it's an important category, even though Lewis isn't a mother. We could call Lewis a mother type, the same way that we could talk about the Apostle Paul that way, or Jesus himself that way.
Seems like for the kids to grow into their full like Narnian selves, it's as much as like it's been a process of changing, as much it's like a returning, like it was there, like we have that dignity. And maybe
Yes.
that's part of where those stories, as much as growing or transforming into our faith, it's a returning to something that was there all along that got covered, lost, missed.
Would you say an awakening to some degree?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I always thought of it as like a going forward, like we're being transformed into something.
Yeah.
Some of that is an uncovering of what was there and has been buried,
Yeah.
lost, forgotten.
Yes. Marred by sin. And I'm even thinking about Screw Tape and his recognition that it's unfair. Everything bends us towards heaven, and the demons have to work so hard to derail that. Everything's just in God's favor. We're so directionally pointed toward heaven.
Yeah, I kind of catch too, like what Ben is saying, it makes me think of how your faith journey is.
Mhm.
You've got it, and then all of a sudden, oh, no, woe is me, and all of a sudden, then you get turned around again, because either the Lord tells you something or shows you something, and oh, yes. What was I thinking? I wasn't thinking. So it's a, what do you call it, transformation, but it's just like an awakening again.
Mhm.
You got a fresh, nice, cool drink of water again.
Yeah. Good.
So that's what life is.
Good. Well, then if we have this introduction of story to Caspian, We now move to Dr. Cornelius. And Caspian begins what I've put in quotes as his proper education. Now, how does this official education relate to those stories? And again, we can think about it in terms of our own faith formation. We begin with faith at home at mother's knee. And at some point, we begin to move beyond that. There is some degree of growing up and needing to reach a little higher, go a little deeper.
I'm not sure if this kind of addresses what you were talking about. But while we were talking before, I was thinking about in so many societies, not so much our own, but oral histories are so important and integral. And, some people would say that they're just telling stories from the past that have a moral meaning or whatever, or they could be real events that happen, but now they've become kind of legend and stories. And I think that's kind of the direction that Lewis is going with this. That they sound like stories, fairy tales or wives' tales or whatever, but they were actually real events that happened and are happening.
So kind of almost when I hear you say that, I think of Sam Gamgee on the stairs on the way to Shelobe's lair.
Yep.
And he realizes that we are actually still in the old stories. We're living it right now. We're characters in the story. We're carrying it on. And he has
That's
this
right.
insight. And Frodo kind of laughs and says, and kids are going to love your character, Sam. And, it's kind of fun.
Strangely, we've read the same books.
That's why I learned certain things at mother's knee, right?
I think
Leave
it was,
Fight for it.
I was thinking of Dr. Cornelius of like, when Jesus says, go and make disciples of all nations, you're going to go and share that gospel. Well, this doctor was imparting to him all the information you needed to know.
Right,
If you don't do this, you're going to die.
right.
You better leave,
Yeah.
pack up and go.
Yeah.
So he was telling him, kind of helping him on that journey that he needed to have to sustain his life.
Yes,
So isn't that sort of like what we're doing when we come alongside someone who's they're going to die.
right.
They're
Faith
dying.
formation.
They're
Yeah.
dying. So and if God brings that person around to you, you walk with them.
Carol?
I was just thinking from the first moment of creation, telling the story has been the task. And in a society that was structured to the only way they could maintain their identity was to tell the story. So it's coming, the Christ story is just a story in the middle of a lot of stories that you can sort of pick out. And so when you get all these dwarf stories and fairy tale stories and stuff going on at the same time, it's kind of the same thing. You sort of reach in and pull out the Christ story. But Dr. Cornelius is very underhanded because he's teaching, but he's teaching him all of this same stuff that the nurse got banished for. But he's calling it astrology and astronomy and giving
So
it all
he's
the-
maybe subversive
he's
rather
subversive,
than
that's the word.
underhand.
Yeah, that's a subversive word.
Yeah.
Yes.
So one of the things I was thinking of was, and again, screw tape letters. And I think it's also a mere Christianity where there is the need to move to deepen and work in faith, right? So remember that the patient, or one of the strategies Screw Tape is saying is, your patient thinks, the the glory from the beginning should always last. Don't, have him maintain that expectation. Nothing else lasts in his life, so don't have him think about why should this last, but, again, have that fantasy closest to his will. And then Screwtape will actually talk about, it's like when the child was read the stories from the Greek, the Odyssey, and then the difference of studying Greek earnestly, right? So I think that when we're talking about faith formation, Caspian in some ways is part of that. Yeah, there's this introduction, and those first stories, very important, form the foundation in some ways, but then there has to be the scaffolding and the building of the house, which is much harder work, right? So studying verbs and nouns and grammars and syntax and astrology and writing and fencing and all sorts of things. Some of it he's really going to like, some of it he doesn't, but it now moves to a harder work. And as you say, Bob, but ultimately what we see is this payoff. Miraz is preparing him to be king, only Miraz doesn't realize that he is forming the king. So there's some neat irony going on here, because Miraz, thinking he is not going to have his own child, is actually preparing the person who could overthrow him, and maybe lights the match. We've got lots of chapters left, so let me just point out a couple more things from chapter 4. I think that we have some foreshadowing happening as they go up onto the astronomy tower. We look out to the West Mountains, the Beaver's Dam, places that we know from the former story. They're a little bit transformed, but they're pointed out particularly in the conjunction of these two planets. And this is victory and peace. And so this is good fortune that is coming. Something new is about to happen. And so we have that sense of the past story, those past victories, the promise, even in the midst of this current crisis, of the future victory, the good fortune that is to come. And so I think we have some foreshadowing going on by Lewis here. I think it's important for us to note too, the way that violence is used within this story to shape a dominant narrative. Nobody's allowed to even think these thoughts, or else they are under threat of pain. And so this is just a fact. Violence is often used, and we're back to the axe kind of model, Norma, where violence is used to try and deny one assertion of what is at the center of history and the most real in favor of another narrative. And so again, we're back to kind of grace being anarchy, grace, this rebellion that's going on, this overthrowing. It's a conflict of two narratives in some ways. We also have this moment of revelation that Dr. Cornelius is not a man. You're a dwarf. And then we have Caspian's reaction, which is fear of Dr. Cornelius.
kill him.
Sorry,
He's going to kill him.
yeah. Trying to find it here.
Sorry, I don't have any page numbers.
Oh, I've got it here. He's not a real man, not a man at all. He's a dwarf, and he's brought me up here to kill me. So it just reminded me from the first story, Mr. Beaver talking about the White Witch. Beware of things that look human but aren't. I say, keep your axe handy.
Mhm.
So, so again, this is a trope from medieval literature. Now, Dr. Cornelius is good. He's honest about who and what he is. So ultimately, he isn't being duplicitous with his identity. He's hiding it for his own protection and for the use, but he is really revealing it. He's not trying to pass himself off to Caspian as a man. Therefore, Caspian is able to work through that initial fear and accept Dr. Cornelius and even be delighted that there are real dwarves. But within the history of this kind of literature, there are false people, right? Things that are bewitched, made with magic that look like a person, but isn't. And so Caspian's initial reaction has some weight to it. Because at the end of the day, that is what a monster is. And that is often rooted in the demonic, right? And in witchcraft, which is usually done with a deal with the devil. Well, anybody have anything to say about any of that I just said?
The one. Sorry.
No, go.
One that I enjoy was the reign of the kings and queens is the golden age, and the land has never forgotten them. I like that.
Say the first half, I got the second half.
So Caspian asks, it's true about the kings and queens tune about the White Witch. Certainly it is true, said Cornelius. Their reign was the golden age in Narnia, and the land has never forgotten them.
Right. So what do you make of that?
Restoring of creation when you're in sync. You're in sync with Aslan, so there's a restoring of all creation.
Yeah.
And immediately after that, he ties the 4 kids to Adam and Eve.
Mm-hmm.
And the golden age was the creation.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I was just processing what Carol said. That your observation, Ben, I think is a great one. It's one I didn't pull out myself as I kind of skim my chapter to make notes, but that is very much in the vein of our role as image bearers over the creation, stewards of the creation. And the Apostle Paul in Romans 8 saying the whole creation is bound over to decay and is on excited tippy toe in anticipation of the revelation of the sons of God, not the Son of God, the sons of God, which would be you and I. And so then, yes, we have the connection. We know that humans are meant to rule in Narnia. And so this is, it remembers a time when their good governance still has memory within the land, particularly at this time when the bad governance has brutalized and forced the spirits of the trees and the water deep into sleep. So there's this memory, and maybe it's this memory and the regaining of the memory of the children and the regaining of the memory of Aslan that then allows the trees and the waters to wake.
It also brings out the element of prophecy.
Mm-hmm.
This doctor said, you're going to be the king. I want to treat you favorably because you'll do good to us when you're the king.
Yeah.
This is all prophecy.
Yeah.
And all through history, what did God do? He kept sending the prophets, listen, do this, follow this, you should follow this, do that. And the people rebelled, they didn't.
Yeah.
So he's trying to bring in that element of, I think, of telling us what's going to happen in the future.
Mhm.
Prophecy.
All good stuff.
Reminds me too, there's so many scriptural references where the items of the world are personified. So the trees clap their hands and mountains,
It's all Psalms.
yeah, it's the
Mhm.
Psalms are full of it. But there's lots of other places too, where the land is actually participating,
Yes.
which I've always understood to validate general revelation.
Mhm.
Because the land has the story and it has the experience. And it was there. We weren't, but it was there from the beginning.
Yeah,
And they can
yeah.
testify to the validity of it.
Mhm.
It's beautiful.
The very earth cries out for your brother's blood.
Yes.
Well, then we move into chapter 5. This is still Trumpkin the dwarf, recounting Caspian's tales. This is his adventure into the mountains. And right off the bat, we have this need for Caspian to flee. So how does Caspian's story reflect the story written by Shakespeare called Hamlet? Are you familiar with that story? Well, we don't need to dwell on it too long. I think, again, there's a handful of kind of tropes out there. This is a trope. So the story of Hamlet is the son of the king. He's fairly sure his father has been murdered by his uncle. His uncle has proceeded to marry Hamlet's mother, the queen, as a means of solidifying his reign. Fairly common practice in ancient kings' governance. And so here it is in this story as well. Caspian's uncle has murdered Caspian's father. He has moved from Lord Protector to governor to king. And now, because he has an heir, he needs to murder Caspian. So we have some resonances here. Part of Hamlet's struggle, you're probably familiar with the big soliloquy, to be or not to be. What we have there is Shakespeare through Hamlet is wrestling with this transition. So in the earlier Germanic culture that this household comes from, to give your word and to seek revenge and to keep your word in executing revenge is honorable. But with the revelation of Christianity, that begins to change. And so Hamlet is a man who is caught between two ways, between two worlds, which is why he can cry out to be or not to be. Is it better to seek the slings and arrows of fortune? Is it better to be like my ancestors, take revenge, avenge my father, and kill my uncle in vengeance? Or is it better to practice this new Christ identity? So I don't know that that's all in here, but I hear an echo of Hamlet. I wonder if there's a bit of an echo that we are navigating between two systems of being or two ways of being. And in some ways, this type of literature, to do this honorably is to do this in the name of Christ. So there's this code of conduct that we saw in The Horse and His Boy. So again, it's fairly clear the way Miraz rules from the former chapter. He governs by fear. That is not the way that Aslan's representatives govern. And that's why the difference in the way the land remembers the two ages is the difference of systems. And so again, I suspect that this is some pointing forward to, we are not going to have the same kind of martial solutions, just as we didn't in the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe that you would normally have. So there is military might, but at the end of the day, that is not the solution. Though conducting yourself within that world, you can do so righteously. Earlier, we were having a conversation about this kind of literature. And we talked about those stories being told over and over again. One of the things Lewis writes about when he writes about Renaissance literature, and particularly the Fairy Queen and some of the other well-known Arthurian stories, is that what you'll see is the different authors tell the same story with slight changes or additions. And Lewis posits one of the reasons why this is so is because every generation is saying, these are the things that we need to know. So it's this rehearsal again and again and again. And you write what's already been written because that is the established wisdom. So again, it's this kind of link in a chain, bringing the past into the present for us, because these are the things that we need to know. So there's this discussion about the horn. And Dr. Cornelius says, who knows? It may have the power to bring the kings and queens from the past. It may even have the power to summon Aslan himself. Does the horn have the power to summon Aslan? The answer isn't in your text. I'm asking you the question. What do you think?
Well,
I don't
most
think it can
certainly.
summon him, but he's gonna hear it, or he will hear it,
Okay,
or
Well-
he already knows it's gonna be blown. You know, something like
okay,
that.
It was Susan's first,
yes.
and who would she be calling except us?
So when Susan is given the horn by Father Christmas, the promise is that when you blow it at need, no matter what, help will come.
Right.
So it's not a guaranteed help.
So if help is going to be helping Susan, who's already the queen, I think it would have to be,
It's not necessarily Aslan is what I'm hearing. It's, but help.
So
But whoever blows it shall have strange help, and no one can say how strange.
that's right. I might show up.
well, the four of them are showing up.
Right.
In that,
So my own answer to my own question is yes and no. So here we have magic, and we'll see in Dawn Treader at one point, Lucy casts a spell from a magician's book, and it's a revealing spell. And as she turns around, Aslan is in the room. And she says, Aslan, how did you get here? And he says, I've been here all the time. Your spell just revealed me. And she says, oh, Aslan, don't be silly. Nothing I do could have any effect on you. So this magic horn, to say that it can summon Aslan in the same way that it can summon the children would be incorrect. So no, the magic cannot be over Aslan because he is over all, including that magic. However, blowing the horn and asking for help or needing help, yes, Aslan hears, knows, and responds. So while it doesn't summon him, it summons him. That makes sense. And he responds by bringing the children, because we see a little later, and I don't think I even got it in my notes, but I remember when I read the first time through, that, oh, I had it and I just lost it. That it is misspoken. Oh, yeah, Lucy says, that, oh yeah, chapter 8, the role of Lucy. So she says, because they're discussing their side of it as they were pulled out of our world into Narnia. And they talk about how uncomfortable that was and how they didn't like it. And then Lucy says, but we want to be here if Aslan wants us here. So what I thought was interesting about that is that they know that they've come because the horn was blown. And yet the conclusion is that they are only there because Aslan desires them to be there. So while the horn blows, and so, you know, there's different levels of causation as we talk about things. So at one level, the cause of the children appearing in Narnia is the horn. At a deeper level, a more significant level, the children are in Narnia because Aslan wants them in Narnia. And so when we translate that into our own formation, into our own Christian lives, there are causes to things, right? This happens because this and that happened. We can see those causes, but sometimes there's the bigger cause, right? The more significant cause that we don't always see. And so one is not denial of the other.
Sounds like Revelation though, too. I mean,
Okay. Oh, with trumpets and horns. Okay.
Lewis, I don't think he pulls in symbols just, oh, well, let's blow in a horn here. You know, how will we know Jesus is coming?
Yep.
Everyone. The
Well, and
trumpet was
again,
down.
Scripture and trumpets. I mean, think of the walls of Jericho.
Yeah.
You know,
Wow.
so yeah, Scripture has a symbolic world that it operates. This literature coming out of that tradition, marrying it with other traditions. Yeah, horns are, again, are a pretty common trope. We see it in Lord of the Rings, the horn of Boromir. You know, they hear it even in Gondor, blowing, 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 and yet, you know, they're so far away. So magic horns, it's part of the world, but you're right. It is drawing on biblical symbology for sure. Yeah. So, and a lot of times that's about timing, right? And particularly the book of Revelation, as we saw, there's this sort of working out. Now this happened, then that happened. The horn blew. Again, just looking at the time. Oh, 8:26. Oh, no, we're not gonna do it all.
That's it.
Good thing you left to chapter 8.
Yeah, yeah. There's, you know, interesting things. There's a relationship between faith, rebellion, exile. Caspian is now in exile with these creatures that to some degree have been exiled. So again, you know, we are in a world that has these same elements. Part of the code, you can't kill somebody once you make them your guest. You know, so I think the moral of that story is kill them as soon as you can.
It's kind of like the angels visiting
Right.
in the Old
Yeah,
Testament.
yeah. But there's also something right and unright, right? And again, we go back to Mere Christianity where Lewis talked about one thing isn't good all the time. There are certain circumstances. So there might be a good to killing somebody, an enemy at the right time. But once you make that enemy your guest, it's no longer the time, right? So again, there's a proper way to live. Note in chapter 6, the idea of the black dwarfs. Hey, up the road is a hag and an ogre. I could go get them too. And they're like, no. And this idea that if we want Aslan to have our part, we can't have them in our membership. The black dwarfs / Nickbrick is kind of the darker flip side of Trumpkin, right? Or Trumpkin is this materialist, science almost, just give me what I can handle, see, taste, touch. Don't give me this fantastic and fantasy. Knickerbock doesn't care. Give me power. I will take Aslan or the White Witch. So that tells us something about him as well. Somehow Caspian doesn't recognize that he's raising an army in order to overthrow a kingdom. And yet he is suited for just that. Something for us to think about there. Trumpkin, for all his doubt, plays a role for us. In chapter 7, we learn about leadership, shared leadership and leadership. How do we go about making decisions? How do we get people to quiet down long enough to start making decisions? Which is the bigger leadership lesson. Again, we have old wives' tales here. We see screw tapes, simple disruptions within the camp. Everybody's kind of tired and short with each other. We have the themes of magical sites, are some places that the children or Aslan are more likely to appear if they come. There is sunrise being a more appropriate time for this sort of thing to be done. And somehow Trumpkin is able to come face to face with the children from the past and still conclude that help has not come, even though the horn has blown. But as a result, we have this testing. What is the benefit of testing? So we have this dwarf of deep doubt. We have this process of testing. We have a result. What's the result?
The dwarf sees who they are
And
and he believes.
he believes. And how is that helpful?
Well, he's interesting because he was believing before. So it's kind of like a Thomas event
Mhm.
where there's some testing. And then when you've tested, then you see. But I'm not quite sure why the dwarf is so, maybe because he's only half a dwarf.
No, he's a full
Oh, he's
dwarf.
a full.
Dr. Cornelius is half
Dr.
dwarf.
Cornelius is a half dwarf.
A half and halfer, as Neckerbeck would say.
Right, so the dwarves are of the earth and have been there in Narnia. So he's kind of a Thomas because he's meeting them and he's beginning to see kingship and queenship unfolding in them.
Yep. He recognizes he's been a fool.
Yes,
Wasted
but
time.
no dwarves are fools, so he wasn't really. And then they have these tests.
Yep.
And
So where I wanted to go with it is just to say he becomes a very loyal subject.
Mhm.
As the story unfolds, because he's become convinced, because he has met these proofs, because he has embraced what he now understands, he is loyal. He will follow them over a cliff. And he has the code too, right? Peter's the high king. We need to listen to the high king. He needs to show the proper respect, deference. He cannot talk to the children. He's willing to even be teased and made fun of a little bit, recognizing that it's good for him because he was foolish and he should not have been. Well, that's the first 8 chapters. We got a few more next week. Any final thoughts before we go? I should probably stop the recording and pray before we go. I don't want to deny anybody a chance. Okay.